is called to order, and we need to do roll call for this one.
Yes.
Yes, roll call please.
Ms. Haynes, Mr. Jimenez, Mr. Johnson,
Here.
Ms. O'Brien,
Here.
Ms. Rodriguez, here, Ms. Rowe,
Here.
Mr. Taylor,
Here.
Thank you. And the first item on the agenda is the consent agenda from Portfolio Management. So, Madam Secretary, if you will read through the consent agenda items.
2.01, approval of contract for DSST Byers High School. 2.02, approval of contract for DSST Middle School 7. 2.03, approval of contract for Near Northeast Community Engagement School. 2.04, approval of contract for Strive Prep Far Northeast Elementary School. 2.05, approval of contract for Strive Prep Far Northeast High School. 2.06, approval of contract for Strive Prep Kepner Middle School. 2.07, approval of contract for University Prep at Steel Street. 2.08, approval of resolution regarding Banneker Jemison STEM Academy.
Thank you. I'll take a motion.
So moved.
Second. Is there any discussion? Thank you. The only thing I would like to say on this is, with regard to the contracts, these are schools that have already been approved, and this is just an approval of their contract. And so, just wanted to make that comment. Thank you very much. And now we will move into, if folks will start coming up, please.
Do we need to vote?
Oh, we have to vote. All in favor? Do we have to do roll call, Madam Secretary? All right, roll call, please.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Ms. O'Brien,
Yes.
Ms. Rodriguez, Ms. Rowe,
Aye.
Mr. Taylor.
Yes.
All right, the consent agenda passes. Thank you, colleagues, for keeping me in line. So this was a special meeting, which I will now adjourn, and we will open up our Focus on Achievement study session for this evening. And our discussion, incredibly important one, and one item so we can really dig in and focus, and it's around the school performance compact and tiered support framework. So if those who are helping to lead us through this discussion will come forward, that would be fabulous. Romano, would you mind pulling up the deck?
Yes.
Are we all here?
We're all here.
Wonderful.
As Ramona gets the deck pulled up, why don't we do really quick introductions?
Fabulous.
I am Melissa White-Bust. I'm the Chief Academic and Innovation Officer. Kelly Kovacic, the Executive Director of Portfolio Management.
Susanna Cordova, Chief Schools Officer. Amy Keltner, Deputy Chief Schools Officer, and I manage the tiered support team.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. This will be a good discussion. Maybe before you all start, I'll ask my colleague Barbara O'Brien. Barbara O'Brien and I have the opportunity to work on a subcommittee, the Performance Committee, and we have been looking at this policy. We've had discussions before, but tonight is really a focus for a board discussion around the school performance compact. So Barbara, will you sort of help frame it for us, please?
Thank you. The Denver Plan 2020 calls for moving a large number of students from underperforming seats in schools to high-performing seats. And in thinking about how to accomplish that between now and 2020, which is really pretty close to now in terms of making big changes in a school district, we have been concentrating on how we can help all kids move up and accelerate in their learning, but in particular, what do we do for kids, students who are in really challenging academic circumstances. They have a lot of making up they need to do in their learning. They don't have a lot of time to do it before they're going into the tougher, higher grades. And we have been thinking about being true to the goals and values of the Denver Public Schools, students first, and what that really means. So this policy is taking a look at what we do on behalf of the kids who are in some of the lowest performing schools in the district. And how do we keep to a guiding principle that we have sort of articulated in our committee of how do we keep students from languishing in schools that aren't right for them or aren't performing well overall. So this discussion tonight is about what does the board believe about the kinds of actions that the district could be taking to make sure that we act promptly on behalf of kids who are languishing in low-performing schools, and what do we do to help those schools get better, and what do we do to create opportunities for those students to accelerate their learning. So this compact has to do with those very challenging, complex questions.
Thank you, that's great, Tom.
Great, so thank you. Very well said. So we'll kick off this, and the focus tonight is much more exactly as Barbara said, is when a school has been struggling for some time to see student growth, and again, what we're looking at is our kids growing and our kids learning regardless of where they come in. And obviously, the overwhelming part of our work is working with schools to make sure that doesn't happen, right? To give schools the supports and the resources, the coaching that they need to improve their performance. And clearly, the goal here is that while we're while we're putting this policy up for discussion, our goal would be that it would never have to be used, right? Our goal would be that every school improves at a level that we're not reaching the point of saying, well, what do we have to do to deal with a school that over multiple years is not demonstrating student growth. I think at the same time as we've looked historically with those efforts, we still have, and clearly this is a situation not just in Denver, but across the state and the country, where schools, and frankly, if we look outside of educational organizations, sometimes do struggle for a period of time despite significant interventions. I think it's important to have transparency about that process and systems, to make sure communities understand exactly what the policy is in the instances where, with a set of supports and after a significant period of time, the school is not demonstrating more growth and learning for kids, what then happens. And again, tonight is focusing on that case. We did come to you earlier this fall, and we're going to be looking to speak a lot more with you about the main body of work, which is what are the supports and resources and interventions for our schools to make sure that our schools are not reaching the point where kids are going through a period of multiple years where they're not seeing the kind of growth that kids need. So that context, Ian.
Yeah, no, thank you both. I also want to thank a huge team and are represented by the leaders in front of us for some really good conversation to this point. You have reached out to various folks internally, and now we're going to start reaching out externally, which is incredibly important to hear from the community about this. But I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, your analysis, your robust conversation, which will continue. So I just want to say thank you for some really quality work on this. It's tough stuff. So with that said, I will turn it over.
Fantastic. So you have really well articulated the objectives that we have for this evening, making sure we understand some of the rationale and the interconnections between the main body of what we do, try to make sure we're supporting well and improving schools, and the compact that we're about to put forward for conversation, and then really have a rigorous conversation. Barbara, you said it well. There are challenges and benefits inherent in the compact that we want to discuss tonight. So the vast majority of the heavy lifting tonight is going to be on all of us to engage in a deep dialogue. We want to set a little bit of context first, and then we'll turn over to 4 essential questions that we're going to put on the table. Others will emerge that we would love the full group participation in thinking through this evening. The context, not surprisingly, is the Denver Plan 2020, and really thinking about our primary aspiration of ensuring that we have great schools in every neighborhood and high-quality seats for every young person in each of our neighborhoods. And we know we have a ways to go to get there. Very specifically, we have more than 30,000 youth who are currently attending schools that are not yet rated green or blue. And as we think about the conversation tonight, we know that we have opportunities to ensure that we support schools in getting to that green or blue bar. And we also know, to Barbara's point, that students who are languishing for significant periods of time in red schools particularly might need a different kind of support from us as a community. And so we're looking very specifically to the language that you all put in the Denver Plan 2020, describing the priority and the interplay between those various strategies in your flexibility language. It's come up a couple of times, how might this compact sit alongside those supports that we offer schools, and so we thought it might make sense for Susanna and Amy to go through a couple of quick slides. There's lots of information that we can provide in follow-up conversations as well.
Sure, so thank you, Alyssa. As Tom alluded to, it's really important that we're talking about all of our schools and the kinds of supports that are important to all schools. Even the most successful school benefits from supports to help them continually refine their program. We created the tiered support framework to do exactly that, to determine how we support all of our schools, from schools that are making adequate progress all the way up to the most intensive needs schools, to ensure that we are using our resources aligned with our belief around equity to give more to the places that need more. The way that we do that is to create a consistent, transparent, data-driven approach to identifying the schools. We look at a variety of different data points, both academic and non-academic factors, some of which we've talked about before, but for example, we look at, in addition to how schools are performing through the school performance framework, we look at non-academic factors that tell us about the health and well-being of a school, things like school attendance, things like teacher retention, other factors that don't always play out in the school performance framework, but clearly tell us about the health and well-being of a school. We then place schools into different tiers, and we provide differentiated supports to schools based on the tier that they're in. As we think about what those differentiated supports that we provide, it is important that there are supports for all schools. So the idea of investing in our people, our time, our money in all schools is really critical. And so we want to make sure that we do that. We try to do that through this the student-based budget, and we also try to ensure that those supports are available through our district-wide programs like our LEAP program, our LEAD program for our school leaders. When schools are at a lower level of performance, we want to start increasing those supports to help them with the lift that they have, to make sure that students have the resources, both the human resources in quality teachers, as well as the school-based resources in terms of materials, technology, things like that, with a real emphasis on building capacity within the school. So lots of emphasis on how is it that we have increased time for teachers as well as for students. Also looking at ways that we support additional opportunities to develop grants targeted to the needs that we see in our most intensive schools. And then we also want to make sure that we're very closely looking at the unified improvement plans in our schools, particularly our highest need schools, and that we're monitoring progress across those schools. And supporting the flexibility decisions that are being made with a real eye toward how is this helping us achieve the ultimate goal of students improving within them. There's lots more information in the appendix, but we thought that was helpful context as we think about the school performance compact.
So we'll segue into a quick overview of the school performance compact and how it sits alongside the tiered school support framework that Susanna just described. So you all have brought up the points already in your opening remarks that it is our primary obligation to support all schools in continuous improvement, from our highest performing schools to our most struggling schools. And And we know as we look at data that sometimes the most important intervention that we can take is to think differently about interventions. And so one of the conversations we want to have this evening is, in what circumstances is closure and restart of a school the most appropriate intervention for the district to take to ensure, to borrow from your terminology, Barbara, that students who are languishing the longest in our lowest performing schools have opportunities as quickly as possible for higher performing seats. And so that's the segue between the supports that we provide all of our schools all of the time and the conversation that we want to have this evening about a school performance compact. We've teased out 4 essential questions. I won't read them to you, but in essence, we really want to talk about purpose, benefits, and challenges. What's the right way for us to think about that small subset of schools for whom restart and closure might be the most appropriate and supportive intervention? And then how do we really think about implementation, the right timeframes, the right mechanisms to ensure that we are implementing well? These are our 4 guiding questions. We're going to pause throughout the deck to open it up for conversation. And as I said already, to make sure that we answer and have time for other questions that arise. The purpose that we have put forth is a purpose that has come from many iterations of conversations. To Anne's point, lots of time with Barbara and Anne. Thank you for your leadership on this topic. Lots of time with an internal working group, as well as some opportunities to pressure test some language with school leaders in Denver. And what we've ultimately come up with is that we have an obligation to ensure all students have access to high quality schools in alignment with our Denver plan, and that by establishing this transparent and consistent policy, we can prevent students from languishing in persistently low performing schools. So that's the purpose statement that we have articulated. We have also documented a number of principles that have emerged. You might think of these as the guiding beliefs of the policy, and we have bucketed those into 4 major categories. It feels important that we have the same accountability processes across all schools, regardless of governance types. Charter schools, innovation schools, direct run schools, as we look at the data, we see that historically we have intervened in all school types. We have closed charter schools, we have closed direct run schools, but we haven't always had the same set of criteria for when we do that and how we do that. So this helps address that gap. To Tom's earlier point, one of the primary principles that we have talked a lot about is the notion of transparency. Schools, students, teachers, communities should be able to predict when the notion of closure and restart is on or off the table for purposes of improvement as well as for purposes of planning. And so transparency has been a driving part of our conversation. Equity, you heard me talk about a little bit in equity across governance type, but we've also been talking about equity of obligations of schools that might be part of a supply chain, that might be a solution for a community where we have recommended a closure or a restart, really wanting to make sure, again, that all schools, regardless of governance type, serve well 100% of our students, including our students who have the most significant needs. And then finally, building on the transparency point, really wanting to make sure we have not just transparency, but two-way conversation and interactions with our communities and families, really seeking guidance from our communities and families with the kinds of schools they want to see in their neighborhoods, and ensuring that they have a voice that matters in helping us ensure that the highest quality seats that they desire are in their own communities. And we will pause there to hear reflections, questions, and comments on our first two essential questions. Does this purpose resonate with you? Do you believe that it's going to help us achieve the ambitious goals you've set forth? And what are some of the potential risks and benefits that are on your minds?
Thoughts, questions? I'll jump in because I can tell Mike wants to say something. What I think is incredibly important here is this is driven based on students. It's not driven by schools. And schools is where kids are educated. but is driven on our deep belief that all students have the right to have access to a high-quality school. We have committed deeply to that as a public institution. So I want to make sure we frame this conversation through the student lens. And what is it that we're doing for students to provide that access? I think that's an incredibly important framework to start this. So I just want to throw that in. I knew it, Mike.
So, and I think, well, I think these are the right answers, the right questions. I think that the work you've done is fantastic. Maybe I said this when we last had this conversation. My only concern about what we're doing, and I see there is some information here about the tiered supports. It seems to me if we're going to have a conversation with a lot of people, I just worry about this part of it being looked at in isolation. So my preference is to have a single policy that takes us all the way through the tiered supports, and that this, maybe there are 8 steps in it, and what we're talking about are maybe steps 7 and 8, but I don't ever want to talk about this, well, ever. I think that when we have conversations with the community about it, we need to be talking about all 8 steps, not just these last 2 steps. So that isn't really a substantive issue. It's more of a procedural. How do we package this, and how do we make sure that people who aren't dealing with this every day understand the context in which these issues come.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, Mike, and we certainly have heard your concern about that. One of the things that we're just getting ready to pilot is a much more visible progress monitoring tool that schools can actually use within the context of their school building that looks at, here are the interventions that we have put into place based on our Unified Improvement Plan, the resources that we have because we've been placed into the intensive tier, and then actually having a place where they can build what is it that students can do to help us, for example, increase our attendance? What is it that the staff is doing to help increase attendance, and what is it that parents can do? And posting that inside our schools on a monthly basis. So Manual is the first school that's going to prototype that. So they're getting ready to do that starting this semester, and then next semester we have another set of schools coming on to pilot that as well, because that piece is really critical. The interventions, the supports, and the progress that we're making.
My concern is really in the area of the tiered support, and that it's not homogeneous, because tiered support in elementary schools is different than tiered support in middle and high schools. And really, when we talk about tiered support, do we know what we're talking about? And I'm not sure we know what we're talking about when we say tiered support, and I think that it has to be in conjunction with what the people in the building actually think that they need, if they know where they are.
Yeah. Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about how support plans are developed?
Yeah, so the tiered support framework has been built over the past 3 years, and so with that, there's been a big focus around how are schools being supported in developing a deep school improvement plan that is certainly grounded and is the Unified Improvement Plan.
Let me stop.
Yeah.
I think what I really mean to say is that, do we have a track record of success with our tiered support?
Yeah. Yeah, so when we look across the various tiers, this really also is part of what is the support that we provide across the chief school's office in general, as well as what are the central supports that we provide. And so when our progress monitoring that we've been piloting is focused most closely on those schools that are at our top tier. So we could bring some data to the table, but really looking at, for the places where we've taken the most intensive interventions, 70% of our schools have been showing improvement from after the intervention was taken. And looking at part of what our structure is looking at is to make sure we really are understanding what is it about the interventions that are showing improvement, what is not, what's the right investment, and how do we really increase that success.
I just want to make sure that we understand when we provide tier support and it doesn't work, do we know why? And if it does work, do we actually know why? And do we learn from that so that when we do it again in a somewhat similar environment, that we have a great degree of confidence now about what?
Yeah, and certainly, I don't know if these are satisfying or not satisfying answers. Certainly a lot of it goes back to what's the quality of the leader, what's the quality of the teachers. And one of the things that we know is it's really important, particularly in our most struggling schools, to be able to build strong teams. That's something that doesn't happen overnight, and that's something that takes, reputation changing to be able to start to attract people into those buildings. The additional supports, additional time for students, so students have more time on task, the additional time for adults. So as you are building that team, you've got both team building time and team learning time. Those supports actually go a long way. In the absence of strong leadership, that's a lot harder to get the payoff on the investment. So certainly, some of the things that we've done is we've prioritized all hiring for our intensive schools above our less intense schools. So anytime there's a principal vacancy in one of our most intense schools, we hire those principals first. We give priority in teacher hiring into those sites as well because we know it's so critical to be able to have those things in place.
That's what I wanted to hear.
I think Michael is next.
I just want to thank you, Landry. I always have that question in my mind too, and I just wanted to circle back, Mike, to your question. We have definitely heard you and have talked about that feedback in our committee meetings, and part of what we're still grappling with is how do you craft a policy that should last for a good period of time, and how do you make sure that the implementation can be flexible to adapt to what's working and what isn't. And so we're still looking for that balance between an overarching long-term policy and that flexibility and responsiveness that we need to get. So we haven't found a great answer, but we're grappling with it.
Let me just put all these pieces together. I mean, what I would really like to see is a combined intensive support and this compacted together. And I'd like to, and I'm just making, I don't know how many stages there are. Let's just say there are 8 stages. And I'd like to say what we're doing. For example, Susanna, what you said, I haven't seen that written down in place. I'd like to see that, once you get to stage 3 in the policy, that you give priority to in hiring for teachers and those things. And then ideally what I'd like to be able to do is to have a policy and work with it for a few years and be able to say, these are the resources we're putting in at this stage, and this is the, cost-benefit analysis for each stage of this. And I don't mind having a policy that we put into place and we work with it a little bit, we get feedback on it, we find out maybe instead of 8 steps, there should have been 9, or there should have been 7, or we should, step 3 should look a little bit differently. I don't mind coming back and revising this policy every year. So I think the goal is to build a policy that lasts for 10 years and we never have to look at it again. But I think this is a very dynamic issue, and I think this is one of the most important things we as a board do. So I think it would actually be positive to come back and revisit it every year and to modify it, make it work. And just to follow up on this whole conversation, I mean, when I talk to people in the community, they don't jump to, is my school, at the brink of being at a restart? They want to know, what do you do for schools that are struggling? And so to be able to, in sort of one place, say, well, this is what happens as we start here. Here's the first indicator, these are the kind of things we do. Here's the second indicator, and these are the kind of things we do. And it keeps getting more and more intense as you work your way down, so that it's a cohesive policy. And again, I don't mind adjusting it every 6 months if we have to, if we start getting feedback. We ought to be doing this based on actual data and actual results in the field.
Anyone else at the moment? Roseland?
So, I, thinking about just the word language, I mean, it just kills you, right? And I guess we need some reliability in this policy. And I'm saying that 2 days after a school board election, because there's going to be directors that don't, they want to preserve the status quo in a situation, or maybe. I'm just, kind of reacting to the recent events, but we do need some reliability for parents and for kids, and it's got to be even over the objections sometimes of some of our leaders, elected or otherwise. And I know that's a big burden, and I think it's probably one that we as a board should hoist. But I just want to put that on the record that whatever we adopt, I think we should adhere to.
So,
Go ahead now.
yeah, I just wanted to jump in, and this is exactly the conversation we need to be having. I so appreciate both Landry and Mike, and then Rosemary following. Right now we have a tiered support system, and as I've been thinking about this policy, and the purpose of this policy is to really provide clarity around when the tiered support system has not been effective for our schools, we need to take different action. And so, while, Mike, I completely agree it needs to be within a framework of what we do as an organization, I think it is appropriate from a policy standpoint to think about providing clarity, most importantly to our students and our families and our schools, and then potentially others who may come in, that based on data, based on where we are, there are a small number of schools where kids are persistently languishing in low-performing schools, and that requires different action. I think if we go, and I think what you're saying makes sense, to a policy that is all-encompassing, we're actually where we are now, but it's written down. And so I think we need to think through that. I mean, I think it's hard, but it's also so important for kids and schools to understand that this Board of Education and this leadership is saying we will not allow kids to languish in persistently low-performing schools, and therefore we are asking the district to take this kind of action. And I feel that is so important for us to be true to our kids and also the goals of the Denver Plan 2020.
I just wanted to restate something we all talked about last May, but in the context of this, that if we really believe in the importance of flexibility in the district moving forward, we have to be careful not to put so many things in, like formulas or steps, that you all can't be flexible, that the school leaders can't be flexible. So somehow I think what we have to do is be clear and consistent, and every community ought to be able to know what's happening in their school and probably what's going to happen to the school if things don't get dramatically better. But at the same time, not go back toward sort of formulas about intervening, knowing that the context of every school is unique, and to work with that, not to give up on our goals, we know where we're headed, but to understand that sometimes you need different strategies and interventions to get to those goals.
Just go ahead. Just one So I completely agree, and so my vision for the policy is that it would be flexible at all of those stages, and would more likely that, well, and wouldn't really need board action to implement it. There would be a lot of flexibility in staff and all of these, again, I'm thinking of it as eight steps down the road. There would be lots of flexibility, but I'd like to be able to, and that the board action would only be needed when we got to the point where it was really a serious situation where you could do something dramatic in the school. But I'd like to be able to have a parent of a school say, well, my school meets these characteristics of a school that should have these, this in this third level down in intensive supports, and therefore, when you're, as you said, Susanna, when you're hiring teachers, we should be getting the priority. I want to make that clear to, if that's in fact what we're doing. I just want to spell it out so that people know, can see, and that we're working with schools at every level along this spectrum.
Maybe as we transition into the next slides, just to summarize what I think I just heard, I think there is a deep interconnection, Mike, to your point, between the daily work of supporting schools, which is obviously our primary work on a day-to-day basis, and is coupled by incredibly hardworking teachers and school leaders who are in our schools every day, seeking to provide better education for their students, regardless of where they are along their trajectory. Each of our employees shows up with that as their aspiration. And because it's not an exact science, while we see progress that is stimulated through interventions and tiered supports, we know that in a very small number of cases, for whatever reason, despite hardworking teachers, principals, and support systems, the work we do every day, we still haven't been able to create the change that we think young people deserve. And so we think that there's another set of interventions that sit alongside the supports that Susanna and Amy just described. We want to talk a little bit about how we might think about an organizing framework that would allow us to determine what's that small number of schools that we really want to think about a little bit differently on behalf of students. And so Carrie's going to walk us through some ideas, and then we'll open it back up to questions, pushback, etc.
So we've spent a lot of time with the internal working group, the board working committee, getting feedback from a variety of stakeholders about how we do think about the criteria in a way that is transparent and aligns to the principles that we identified earlier, but also allows us to have clarity and ensure that we're designating those schools that have had just a tremendous challenge in making the fundamental changes that are necessary for students to be able to thrive despite the incredible educators and the work that's happening. And so have come up with three places where we think are the right criteria in terms of thinking about a fair and transparent approach. I'm going to give an overview of the three gates, as we've been calling them, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into how we're thinking about each of those playing out. So first, looking at persistent low performance as identified through the school performance framework, and thinking about the track record that a school has shown through the SPF measure that we use. Also then looking at whether or not a school is making demonstrated growth in a single year. So the SPF is a 2-year indicator. It comes out every year, but it looks at 2 years worth of data. So wanting to ensure that we are identifying those schools that in a single year are beginning to make tremendous gains, as we certainly don't want to stop that upward trajectory. And so making sure that we're looking at that single year academic growth. And then wanting to ensure that we have a way to get a real holistic understanding of how a school is doing. And so looking at those improvements that are research-based leading indicators of turnaround success. And so we've got 3 gates that we have identified, and I'm going to spend a moment just talking through with a little bit more detail each of those 3 areas. So in terms of thinking about how do we understand the school's track record of persistent low performance, looking at whether or not a school has had 3 years of red or orange on the SPF, or if their 2 most recent years have been red, and feeling like that is a solid indicator of persistent low performance in terms of track record. Then thinking through their most current year growth, and in the first year that a school moves through that gate 1. So for the first year that a school has
Kelly,
had.
real quick, when you say, for example, the 2 most recent years of red, we're actually talking about 3 years of data based on the way the SPF is calculated.
We are, yes. Yeah, thank you for pointing out that clarification. So it would be 2 years of red on SPF, but it would be, they would have to have at least 3 years worth of data. Yeah.
And just also for clarification, if it's 3 years red or orange, it's referencing 4 years of performance.
Right, thank
That
you.
covers 3 years red or orange.
Thank you.
So in the first year that a school moves through gate 1, that they would move through gate 2 if they fail to meet expectations or exceed expectations on 1-year growth indicators as measured by the SPF. If a school is removed in their first year from gate 2, because we see that they're making improvements, but the next year they're red or orange again, and so move through that gate 1, they would immediately move to gate 3. And gate 3 is a school quality review that would be used to understand the holistic view of what is happening inside of the school and whether or not in those indicators that are tied to turnaround success, we're seeing improvements according to a rubric that we would be using with a third party who would be conducting these SQRs. And so if a school fails to meet expectations on a majority of those indicators on the SQR, that would then be reason to recommend to the board designation for closure or restart.
So help me understand then how many years it takes to get to this spot. So it's really 4 years of bad performance, and then it's really a 5-year process.
It's either 4 or 5, Mike, depending on what triggers that first gate. So
Right.
if a school was red for 2 years on the SPF, that looks at 3 years of data. And then you jump down to gate 3, which is the current year, the year we're in right now. Do we have evidence that the leading indicators are headed in the right direction? And that aligns with charter school statute. So our charter school contracts by state statute are 4 years upon initial issuance. So there's a nice synergy there in terms of timelines. It also felt like a reasonable amount of time to really ensure that we could look at both multiple measures, different kinds of data sets, qualitative and quantitative, felt really important in the conversations we've had, but also patterns over time, so that we are making the end of the process a decision that helps us feel assured that students will have the best access to the highest quality seats as quickly as possible.
So what worries me about this is if it's a 5-year process, kids are going to lose. I mean, the argument for making it shorter is that kids are going to, these are real years of kids' lives, and maybe this is a separate conversation. But as part of this, maybe we also ought to be thinking that if schools are in this spot, that the kids that are having to go to those schools maybe should have some kind of preference to transfer to a better school, so they don't have to sit in school for 5 years, miss 5 years of education, while we're making up our mind about what to do with their school.
Can I clarify though? So the 5 years that you're talking about is only in the instance where there's been the persistent low performance over the period of 3 years. But the most recent year shows some growth. So there would still be, so how would,
In that
Yes.
instance, again, the recent year showed significant growth. The school would continue, right? This policy, this would not impact that school. I think to your point, a couple of thoughts, Mike, is I think this is a real issue for us to discuss, is you want enough data to make a good decision, right? As we said, if a school is red for 2 years in a row, it's 3 years of school data, historical, and then you're looking at current year school performance through all the qualitative indicators, which is a 4th year. And so very important. I think a couple of points on that. One is, under federal law, a school that is a red or orange school, the students that are No Child Left Behind, right, do have the right and the preference and transportation to attend other district schools. So that priority and the accompanying transportation already exists with us as a result of federal law. And so I think, that is important. I also think clearly, and this is discussion, which is this policy is meant to address a situation, whether district-run or charter, where significant interventions are not succeeding. In your case, with 1 year of bad performance, right there, this is where the tiered talks about your point about how these things are interconnected. The tiered support framework is immediately calling out that instance, and sets of interventions are then being provided for that school. And that's everything, in some cases, looking for a new leadership. In some cases, it's other staffing changes. In almost every case, there's a significant increase in resources. Those could be mental health resources, tutoring resources, coaching resources, and the like. Then, if that school then is in the second year, continuing to struggle, then on tiered support framework, again, that steps up the degree of intervention. So I think, again, we're not waiting 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before acting. I think the question is to hit this policy where effectively you're saying the degree of lack of growth has been significant for a long enough period of time, that we are going to, in effect, restart that school. And again, we're not closing any school buildings, we're not asking any kids to go anywhere else. The question is, in that building with those kids, providing essentially a restarted school activity.
Just to add to what Tom was saying, one of the flags that we use in tiered supports framework is a dramatic drop in SPF. So we actually have some schools that are yellow in our highest support tier because there have been drops in performance.
Well, and obviously, the tension here is we don't want to give up on something that has hope, but the other side, this conversation
We want to have
comes out,
good
is
experiences
we
for
don't want
kids,
kids to lose years of education that they'll never really be able to recover if they could. So it's a real tension here.
And I think part of it, and to build on what you're saying, there is, and that's the debate here. One of the things we're finding in front of the table is the smaller the number of students in the school, the higher the beta is, right? The higher in any 1 year you're going to see either, a big jump up or a big jump down. So that's another thing. When you got 1,000 kids, you don't see generally lots of big jumps up or bumps down. If in an elementary school right now we're only getting state growth data, remember 4th and 5th grade kids. That might be 80 kids, 60 kids, 100 kids. So that's the other thing to,
You could have one classroom where
That's making a
things
huge
are not
difference, yeah.
working well and the data for the whole school is affected.
So I think our point as we think about this is, how do we have a clear and transparent policy that communicates to the community, to schools, but at the same point, doesn't, you mentioned this earlier, Barbara, doesn't tie our hands, that if you have 1 year of terrible data, you've got to step in, very aggressively in terms of improving that school. And that quote, terrible data could be qualitative data around instructional practices, culture. It could be terrible data around student achievement data. And so how do we provide that clarity, but at the same point don't limit, right, the ability of dramatic interventions where, in a given year you're seeing a dramatic decline in qualitative performance.
I think the other hope, Mike, with the way in which we've put together this criteria is that it's actually going to allow us earlier to flag schools that are moving closer towards hitting this criteria and a designation. And so it allows us to strengthen, as we've been talking about, our interventions. The other thing just to mention in the implementation, which we'll be going to in just a moment, is any school that moves through gate 1, regardless of whether or not they're removed in gate 2, we would provide a school quality review, believing deeply in that diagnostic data that provides the school community and us as a central staff to be able to support them. So the goal would be that there are lots of interventions being put in place in a way that is ensuring that we are creating learning organizations at the school site that will allow for rapid improvement. So want to shift to implementation and some of the things that we have been thinking about and want to present to the board for discussion. But prior to doing that, just want to ensure that there aren't any more questions in particular about the criteria as we've outlined them here.
Madam President, may I have a moment of personal privilege?
Sure.
I just want to thank our colleagues who were reelected. Thank you for running and thank you for being elected. Rah, rah, rah.
Thank you.
So we will spend just a moment going through the policy implementation and then have a question for the board to have some conversation about that will help us as we think through implementation. So one of the things that the board working committee has spent a lot of time talking about and also reinforcing in each of the conversations is that when we have a school that is going to go through a restart experience, wanting to ensure families that what their students will be experiencing the next year will be a high quality seat. And so we are thinking very, very carefully about how do we ensure that as we are passing policies such as this, that we are also building a strategy for ensuring that we have an adequate number of high-quality programs and applicants that will go through our call for new quality schools to be a provider for a school that is going through restart. Wanting to ensure that we are providing supports equally for our district-managed applicants alongside our charter applicants. And wanting to make sure that we also, especially in cases where we have a new leader that is in a school and shows a great amount of talent and passion, and we are seeing somebody with great capabilities, that person and that school design is supported through the application process. And then also that any new school model is going to be selected based off of our call for new quality schools, which is about ensuring that we have quality applicants and then the criteria that's set forth in the facility allocation policy. In terms of what this looks like with regards to a timeline, the goal would be that we would be designating schools by November of a school year. So we would have conducted the school quality review and have made a recommendation to the board. That the call would be released in December with a March deadline to give a window of time for all of our applicants to be able to put together a really high quality application for us to review. And then in June, we would make decisions both about those school models that have met the criteria bar through our call, and then would make a placement recommendation to the board for a vote based off of the facility allocation policy. Would then have a year zero planning year, particularly in the short term as we're building up our supply chain. We can imagine a world in which there might be a number of programs on the shelf that we could actually move towards a restart slightly earlier, but do believe that initially we are going to need to ensure we have that year zero of planning. And then 12 months later, the school would open in August. So I want to pause here just for a moment before we shift to a staff recommendation about when implementation should occur to see if there's any questions about this timeline or space for conversation.
So I'm thinking about this in conjunction with the last conversation we were just having. And I'm not sure where one leaves off and the other begins, but this is essentially a 2-year phase, right? And this is 6 months of the call, we make a decision, a year zero, and then essentially a new start with it. So if I think about that in conjunction with the last conversation we were having, including the potential of up to 5 years in that process, that's a long time before the kids that we've been thinking about need something different. So it makes me think differently about the conversation, and, you know, we looked at some of those as sequential steps, but, you know, I wonder if it's first this, then that, you know, and then we still have, then we have to start this process, and that takes, you know, 6 months. You know, I think we need to think about all of these as one flow, and whether or not, if you went through the line, whether we can justify a process that's 7 years down the road.
So if I remember this correctly, or if I understand it correctly, the problem is that we've let this go on for years already. So we already have 4 or 5 years of data on schools. So one thing we've talked about is, what does it mean to have the first year of this policy take place? And what does it mean to do it in a year when we're not going to have growth data or early data? Now, that won't be true for the second year of this policy, but we do have track records for these schools. So at some point, we're going to be acting on schools that have been in this pipeline for too long anyway. And what we hope we do is get to a point where the interventions are working and that number of schools has really shrunk and we can anticipate them. If you'll notice on one of the earlier pages, there was a footnote
Yeah, I
saying
saw that.
that nothing would stop the board and the superintendent from intervening in a school that was having a precipitous decline, some language like that. So, I mean, to your point, Mike, about needing to revisit this, it is awkward because we're having a year without growth data, but we also have this pipeline that we haven't acted on, and we're trying to lurch us into 2016 and get the pieces moving together.
And if I'm sorry, you know, one thing, we spent a lot of last year looking at what has been effective in turnaround and what has not been effective in turnaround. We worked with A+, I think several of you participated in some of those. One of the things that we feel very strongly, both with district-run schools and in the charter community, is that not taking the time where we're seeing it here is detrimental to the new school's ability to be effective. I think we can look back at several schools and we recognize we rushed the turnaround efforts. Our ability to onboard teachers, both in the selection of teachers as well as in the training for teachers in a compressed timeline, is very detrimental to the school's ability to then be successful as they launch. And so then getting that right balance of how much time is enough time for interventions to take hold. If we don't have enough time, I think we could very easily see ourselves intervening time after time because there's not enough time for it to take effect. And then also wanting to make sure that the intervention, the new school that comes in, has the optimal opportunity for success. In the absence of that, I think we will set ourselves up for a churn in our most vulnerable neighborhoods.
Yeah. So I just want to build on that because you said that much better than I ever could, Susanna, but I think it's incredibly important. We've seen from our record of turnaround, it's incredibly mixed, not wanting to rush in and this huge sense of urgency that we all feel. But if we are going to create an opportunity for sustainable improvement in truly high-quality schools, I think this policy sets up the importance of urgency, but also the importance of doing this in a quality way so it's sustainable. And if we look at this policy and if it comes to fruition, it will start impacting students in 17, 18. So the 7-year is true if you are starting from year 0 today, but it will actually be impacting students in 17, 18.
So that's helpful, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm looking at this to me is the key to success. If we've gotten, to the edge of the cliff, this is the key to success. And I guess, so the question is, what's year zero here? Because it is, if you start at this point, it's an awful lot of years. I mean, I hadn't thought about that when you mentioned it, and I was like, wow, yeah, that's an awful long time. But and recognizing that we're in an awkward year in between, that doesn't eliminate the prior years of performance, and so does it make sense to use the quality reviews, for example, at an earlier stage? Then, so that we're looking to see, are those indicators really there that suggest to us, okay, well, maybe, they're not, ready to, they're not on the edge of the cliff after all. That these things, the time to actually make some things change. I mean, a new leader, a new team, I mean, we hear that time and again, that how long it takes to sort of turn the ship around. And when can we have the indicators in place or use? And it seems to me that the quality review is the key to that, because it's flexible. It's not dependent on a year's worth of data. It is, we need to go now because the data is saying one thing, but we want to be sure that we know either it's going this way, or they instituted some changes a year and a half ago. They're still in the data shows they're still in the red or the orange, but here are the indicators we see that suggest that maybe we don't go down the restart or path, the closure path, because there's hope. And that's what I was trying to get at, is where do we actually apply the process where we determine is there hope here or not, before we start then a whole new process, which is, it should be this length. I mean, this year zero idea, I think, is a fundamental change that we've instituted that is critical to success. And it does make it longer, of course, but I think it is, data points to some essential to long-term success. Otherwise, we're in turnaround every 4 years or whatever.
So I think to summarize what I'm hearing, it feels like one of the really important elements of the conversation is the policy is not meant just to create a designation line, but to create changes across the system so we all continue to get better at the work that we're doing. Get better and more precise at the supports and interventions for schools, but also get better and more precise at creating the right supply of new schools who are ready to open well with excellence and equity on day one of operation. And I could imagine, happy to your earlier comment, and I think Kelly was also commenting, a world in the future, once we've created some of those changes, where you had a school who came through and applied, and you had high confidence in their ability to open well on day one. The board made a designation decision in November, and that school might be able to be ready by the following August because they had done their design work. We don't at this moment have a supply of high quality schools and leaders on the shelf where we can say to you with confidence, we know that on day one this will be a school with the utmost excellence and equity. Could we envision a world in the future where we could be there? I think we really could, and we hope that this is the kind of policy that allows us to build on some of the great work that's already happening and also see that work a little bit differently, so we have a different reality for young people.
Can I add one more thing? And I apologize for going back to the previous discussion. We're looking at data that focuses on how schools themselves have implemented, because they're in tiered supports. Presumably, if a school's red 1 year, we're doing something, right? Or even orange, and if they were something else before. And at one point, I think the policy has to take into account, if we're talking about shared accountability, what we're doing, what we're doing. I mean, the supports and the interventions, whether these are the right things. And so it isn't just the data from what the school has or hasn't done, but also what we have or haven't done in terms of the right interventions and the right supports. And I don't know that I necessarily see that reflected here, but I think that's really a critical piece of this. If we're going to have shared accountability, and it causes us to make sure we're, when we see the signs of struggle, that our stepping in, our interventions, our supports are what they need to be.
We can wrestle with what some language around that might look like, should we get to the point of crafting the language of a concrete policy. So our proposal, based on this conversation, is should the board choose to proceed with a policy and choose to proceed with an adoption this year, we would recommend implementing the policy for the first time in the fall of 2016 for many of the reasons we just discussed. For the fact that we see work that we want to do to ensure that we are all well prepared, both to create the right supply chain, but also to think through the many nuances of implementation that we want to own from an accountability perspective, but also because we know that there are expectations and processes underway. And from our value of integrity, really thinking through the commitments that we have made to great talent in school buildings and communities, as well as the commitments we've made to families, knowing that we're right upon the choice season and a number of other important moments in our school year. Our recommendation would be that if adopted, this policy starts taking effect in 2016, which would not prevent the superintendent and board from making intervention decisions, potentially up to and including restart decisions this year, but that the fullness of this policy would begin a year from now, and we would spend that intervening year making sure we were really strong in implementation.
And that's the part to build on, Liz's comment. In the vast majority of schools where we have seen low growth over several years, we've hired, gone out and recruited talented new leaders, recruited talented new teachers to come, many of whom this is their first year, and in some cases their second year, and appreciate the work they're doing. They've got really, really important work to do, and to give them that ability to show that growth this year. And obviously, they also had their SQR, that the school quality review that would come up the following year. But I think, again, this is not a case where you've got a full series of schools that where no action has been taken for multiple years. In every case, when you look at schools that have seen low growth over multiple years, there have been actions that have been taken around leadership, around staffing, around program supports in the last 2 to 3 years.
So our general proposal on timeline, and then would love to hear if there's pushback on the timeline implementation. We're obviously having a conversation this evening. Should the board request from us tonight a drafted policy that we come back to you with a pretty quick turnaround time, try to articulate some of what you see in PowerPoint form here in more of a narrative form, building on some of the conversation that we had tonight, adding in some of the points that you have made, therefore allowing 2 public comment sessions, one in November and one in December, for us to hear from the community. What's not on here explicitly would also be some conversations that would happen outside of the board context to ensure that we were able to have conversations with community in a more robust, sometimes more intimate setting than our public comment sessions provide. And then should the board so choose to have the policy come back in December for your board meeting for your vote.
Is December 10th already on the schedule?
I don't know the answer to that question.
There's already been a work session scheduled all along, and then it was to add that on the end of that.
Yes.
So we'd love to hear, does this feel like the right set of potential next steps, the right timeline? Are there questions about the proposal regarding implementation?
I think this is great. I think the work has been fantastic. Thank you all for all the hard work. And I know I made a lot of comments. They weren't meant to be critical. Again, come back, the risk of being redundant, my biggest comment is to put this in context, so that it isn't just this isn't viewed as just this little piece of what we're doing in struggling schools. So you can see this is part of a continuum. And I think in that context, I think that this is clearly some of the most important work we're going to be doing in the next few years. It's a big challenge, but it's hard work, but it's the right work. It's the work we have to do. So thank you so much.
Welcome. I think we can try to grapple with some language, Mike, that gets to the spirit of what you're talking about, which is not a standalone compact or policy. It sits within a broader context, and the comments I think Barbara is also feeling strongly about, which is not locking ourselves from a governance perspective into a set of management behaviors that are maybe better addressed in other venues that are more flexible and nimble in terms of responsiveness. I don't have the perfect solution in my brain yet, but I think there is a way we can take both of those essential values and craft some language that speaks into both of them.
Can I just like to say, to your comments, real thank you. And Barbara, these issues are incredibly hard. And comments couldn't be viewed as, compared to what we've been trying to discuss among ourselves, right, there's such a hard balance here of, on the one hand, extraordinary urgency with dramatically improving school opportunities for kids where they haven't been growing. At the same time, the imperative of change takes time. It takes time to root, it takes time to grow. In particular, in almost every case here, we're dealing with communities that have some of the highest needs kids in the city, very high degree of student mobility. In many cases, multiple years of struggle in attracting and keeping the best teachers, in having families in those communities say this is the great school for my kid, given some of the perceptions that sometimes we have in the community. And I know, and I want to publicly acknowledge we have some extraordinarily hardworking educators, teachers, school leaders, and support teams in the schools who are working their absolute hearts out for our kids, and we respect that. And they need to have time to put those improvements in place, and this is the balance, right? We've got to be urgent. Kids aren't growing, and that growth is, we're not seeing that growth in 3 years. We do have to act, and I think the opportunity here to be very clear and transparent about what the standards are, what the process is for parents and for communities and for schools. I think it is important, and I think just what you said is an acknowledgement of how hard it is to get right the balance of those competing values.
I couldn't agree more, and ditto on thanking both my board colleagues and all of you. This is an extraordinary amount of work while we're still trying to run the ship. And it is hard, and we're not going to get it perfect. We can't let perfect be the enemy of good here. And progress, because progress is what we're seeking. And I go back to a point that Barbara raised in her retreat, how 3 years ago, so what we've got to ask ourselves is what's different. We're talking about urgency and making change and trying to get to get a different trajectory. The test that we have to ask ourselves, and it's the reason why I raised the question about our responsibility here too, because if we're looking at outcomes over a series of years, but we look at what happened and none of us was doing anything different. The school was saying, just give us time and we'll be better, or we'll and it isn't that we'll work harder. There isn't, I don't think there's a school anywhere in this district where we can expect them to just work harder. They're all working hard. That isn't the issue. It's what are we doing differently that's going to change the direction that we're going. And we have to ask ourselves that those indicators, those things that we check, all of us together, and say, what are we doing differently? And then providing the support and the time to do those things differently, and for them to produce the results. And I think we can say maybe we didn't get it perfect, but if we know that we've done the things, that we've made the changes that we think, that we've done the research, and these are things that we know are the right things to do, and we have the right people doing them, and with tools and all of that stuff. So each of those things, I think, is a question that we have to ask moving forward. And it is a balance. And to your point earlier, it isn't a formula. We have data, but there's a lot more to this story than just what the data says. And a lot of that is what all of us together are doing differently, and what we're learning, and how we're applying what we're learning about the way we should go. I think this timeline is right. It speaks to the urgency. We need to get this going, but yet we don't implement it until the fall, and in the meantime, we have a chance to really think about it. We obviously, Mike raised it earlier, reconciling it against the policy we have around flexibility, is a discussion between now and December 17th that we have to have, because I'm not sure, how much or where it does reconcile, and we need to have some clarity around that, and perhaps other policies that we have in place.
So I'm hearing that as a request for us to prepare the next step of the conversation for mid-November, and we can rely on our great board leaders of our working group to help give us some more direction on that, Barbara, and really enormous thank you. I have to add to the thanks that have already been given your thought leadership and collegiality in the spirit of having really tough conversations has been tremendous. Thank you for that. And we also have to thank some folks who are sitting over here, Maya and Jennifer, who have done the vast majority of the work prepping our deck. Kelly and I hopped off an airplane around noon today, which means that our team here was holding down the fort and making sure we were well prepared for tonight. So thank you for that.
It's always a great team effort. Thank you.
Wow. We're done early, Ann. Did you